Eternal Church. How you doing? Happy Wednesday. It's Jacob here for another midweek meal prep where we get together to get into God's Word so that we can get our hearts and minds ready for the sermon to come. Let's go ahead and get into it. As always, we are continuing with our series in the Gospel of Mark. And today we are in Mark chapter 15, verses 16 through 32. It's February 15th. We're getting dangerously close to the end of this gospel, but there's still lots of good stuff left. So, first off, we are doing this because as a community, we're striving to be men, women, and children, living lives of witness wherever we are, whatever we do, home, work, play, wherever. And we do this each week through word and deed by treasuring the truth of the gospel, the meta-narrative, God's grand rescue story, which then leads us to worship Jesus Christ and grow in communities of faith. And this could be in your home, in your family, in your community group, in your small group, but we just want to be growing together so that we can be growing in the greater community. And we are going to do this today as we do every week. It goes 3 simple steps, and this is for everyone. And you can do this anywhere in the Bible. The first thing we do is select the passage. We liken this to choosing a cut of meat. Yesterday was Valentine's Day. I had a chance to cook some steaks, and it's very important when you select the meat that you know the best way to cook. It's portion of fat to protein. You need to realize there's some nuances with the place on the animal that you select to cook because they don't all cook equally. And the same thing is true for Scripture. We want to make sure that we understand the difference between narrative, poetry, wisdom literature, epistle. And so we choose the cut of meat. We help to study it. We identify it. We prep the ingredients. We look at the original languages. We get the original context, what the original audience would have understood. And then we kind of tie it all together. We understand or discover the big idea. We process the meal. We realize that this is all about a particular message that the author had intended, similar to a particular recipe that a cook intends. So let's get into it. The first task is to select the cut of meat, which means we base the sermon or study on some unit of biblical thought. We want to make sure we're not skimping and just getting like a single verse to look at. We also want to make sure that we're not short selling it. We're not doing too much. We're not trying to cover too much space. So we need to find out what the limitations of the passage are, what precedes it and what follows it. As we said this week, we're in Mark. Oh, I didn't change it. I didn't change it here. Okay, so really we are in Mark 15 verses 16 through 32. But last week we looked at Mark 15 verses 1 through 15, power plays, those dynamics between the Sanhedrin and Pilate and Jesus and Barabbas. This week we are looking at the actual crucifixion. If I were preaching, I would call it adding insult to injury, because it's not just about the physical abuse that Jesus endures. It's also about various characters mocking him. We've got lots of mocking to look at today. And then next week, we're going to look at Jesus breathing his last breath, or as I would call it, famous last words. But today, let's get into it. Mark 15, verses 16 through 32. This is God's word for you, God's people. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him, kneeling down in homage to him. When they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put on his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them, decide what each should take. It was the third hour when they crucified him, And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. God's word for you and me, God's people. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the things that jumped out to me. And I underlined and circled a few things. Here's the questions that I came up with. Where is the palace, and is there a significance with where it is? We know that there's maybe a few potential alternatives. We've got where Herod lived. We've got where the Sanhedrin had this covert operation, this covert tribunal. That would be where the chief priest resided, but is that where the governor's headquarters would be? We need to figure that out. How big is a battalion? What's the significance of purple and a purple robe? And then we need to look a little bit more closely at the crown of thorns and the King of the Jews. That phrase. Again, it's a phrase that really was probably floated by the high priest to Pilate, because originally the accusation was blasphemy against God, and then all of a sudden it turned into Jesus is going to be king, a rival to Caesar. He needs to be put down as an enemy of the crown, so on and so forth. Next page. Who is Simon of Cyrene? And then, why did Mark include the names of his kids, Alexander and Rufus? It would seem that this is really rare to randomly include names. We know that there's a few examples of characters who remain unnamed, but this seems really detailed in particular. So, what is the significance of all of these names? We get to Golgotha, the place of the skull. It sounds ominous. And that's the place where Jesus is crucified. So what else do we need to know about that? What's with this wine mixed with myrrh recipe? And then taking a deep look at crucifixion. I know it's not a particularly happy subject, but I mean, this is kind of the centerpiece of the story of God. This is the pivotal sacrifice of Jesus, and so we need to understand. I guarantee you and I have not seen crucifixion. And so we need to understand the nitty-gritty about this terrible punishment. Divining garment and casting of lots. Spoiler alert, this is fulfillment of prophecy. And finally, we need to be looking at the mocking. There's various characters, the soldiers, the spectators, the chief priests and scribes, and then even the co-crucified robbers. So we've got a lot to look at today. First guess at the big idea. As always, we look at this in terms of subject, complement, and big idea or exegetical idea. The subject being there's a topic or a subject hanging over this entire passage, and we want to phrase it as a question. I would say that the subject, before I try to dress it up, is just mockery, actually, because we all know that Jesus is abused, misused, mistreated. There's a lot of physical violence going on. But what you see happening over and over and over, this word mocking, or similar words that mean the same thing. And so I would have to guess that why did the people mock Jesus? Why did all the people mock Jesus? Everybody probably had their own reasons, but that's the big question. That's the one that kind of ties this all together. The answer to that is maybe he appeared to be a failed fraud. I mean, they basically described him as impotent. You know, he was described to be a king, but he had no power. He was described to be the Messiah, but he couldn't save himself. So the big idea that I'm putting forward initially is the soldiers, chief priests, scribes, spectators, and co-crucified robbers mocked Jesus because he appeared to be a failed fraud. And they probably thought he was getting what what came. It reminded me a little bit of gotcha journalism in today's culture, where you have a public figure and all of a sudden something scandalous comes out and everybody turns on them. Maybe a little bit of like this cancel culture idea. And these same people that had been fans of Jesus previously, now they see him as being impotent, powerless, not able to even help himself, let alone help other people. So maybe they thought he was a snake oil dispenser. Maybe they thought that he was just too good to be true. But that's where I'm going initially. So let's get into it. Let's prep the ingredients. We need to look at 3 different lenses: the world behind the text, within the text, and before the text. And as we've done recently, we're going to do this all on the same page. So when we talk about the world behind the text, we're talking about the background context. We're talking about the world that the original audience would have seen and understood without even thinking about it. It was just the air that they breathed. And you need to remember that even though that Jesus is dying probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 33 AD, this is actually being written about 30 years later. In somewhere in the mid-60s, it's being written by Mark, and so he's writing not just to people in Jerusalem and in Judea, he's actually writing specifically to people in Rome. That's going to come back into play. So it's part of the original context going on behind the world behind the text. But then there's a few other word, phrases, ideas that we need to look at. Palace, the governor's headquarters. Well, before I get into that, let me go back one. Can I do that? Here we go. This was Mark. I read one of the commentaries. This is Mark's passion prediction back in Mark 10. 33 and 34 telegraphs almost perfectly Jesus' interactions with both the Sanhedrin and the Roman government. So that's one thing that we need to see, that everything that's happening now, he foretold to a very explicit degree. And I'll just go ahead and reread it to you. Back in Mark 10, verse 33 and 34, it says, Jesus says, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes," delivered over, handed over, turned over. They will condemn him to death. So the Sanhedrin condemned him and deliver him to the Gentiles, to the Romans. And they will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. So everything that's happening is going exactly according to plan. This is exactly what Jesus has foretold multiple times, but that was just the most recent time back in Mark 10. So we get to this question of the palace, the governor's headquarters, and we see that it's actually referred to as the Praetorium, which would have been probably commonplace in Rome. The Praetorium is a Roman fortress for its highest ranking leader in any given area. It could range from anything from a tent to a big physical fortress, an edifice, a building. But it refers first to the elite soldiers who protect the prefect, like the personal secret service of Pontius Pilate. So that's the Praetorium. And then to the building. The building was probably, we believe, in this context, it was within the Herodian fortress. The Herodian fortress was built by Herod's dad. It was the most spectacular building other than the temple complex in Jerusalem. It was kind of a cross. It was on the western side of Jerusalem, and because, remember, they said that Herod moved mountains. He actually took one hill and moved it to the top of another hill in order to make it look like a mountain, and that's where he built this fortress. And so it's very possible that that's where everything has happened after that secret tribunal. Jesus has been taken to the Romans. He's been taken to Herod's fortress, and he's been interrogated by Pilate, and now he's being taken back to some sort of a cell. I never picked up on this before, but I think in John's Gospel, John 19, it says that the trial of Jesus was at Gabbatha, 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 and then the crucifixion is at Golgotha. I had never had really seen that before. Of course, it seems like we've got some wordplay going on. So just something for you to keep in mind. Let's see. A battalion, or in some translations, a whole company of soldiers, comes from the Greek word spira. It's a Greek military term for the Latin term cohors, where we get cohort. It's 1/10 of a Roman legion. Now, a Roman legion would have been 6,000 soldiers, so a tenth of that would be 600. So we've gone from probably a fairly small group of soldiers initially taking Jesus into custody, bringing him before the Sanhedrin, then bringing him before the Roman guards. Now it's all escalating. And again, remember, the Sanhedrin really wanted to have the Roman muscle. They wanted to have the Roman backing. And so certainly 600 men to escort one guy who's been peaceful up to this point seems a bit overkill. But again, it's probably not so much just about escorting Jesus, it's also fear of potential unrest within the crowd. The purple cloak, what you want to know is that purple is the most costly and rare of ancient dyes. It appears again in the book of Acts with one of the first followers of Jesus. It represented royalty. So anytime you see purple in the Bible, and maybe even in the ancient Near East, you would know that because it's so rare, so expensive, that it was reserved basically just for the richest, and the richest were always rulers, kings. So purple cloak represented royalty. The crown of thorns and King of the Jews also signified or symbolized royalty, though they both were articles of mockery. The crown would normally have been made of gold leaf, and it would have symbolized royalty, and this is a painful alternate. Basically, thorns and thistles from the Mediterranean would have been pulled together and then shoved on Jesus' head as a sort of crown. And then they called him the King of the Jews. When they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," this would have been actually a parody of a regular Roman salute for Caesar. Ave Caesar, Victor Imperator, or Hail Caesar, the victor and the emperor. And so this definitely mocked Jesus directly, but it also mocked the Jews because basically the Romans were, putting forward the fact that this was a pretty pitiful king for pretty pitiful people. So there was all sorts of equal opportunity offense going on here. And then we see this Simon of Cyrene and Alexander and Rufus, father and sons. Now, I want to go ahead and just read a little bit from James Edwards from the Pillar Commentary, because there's so much here about Simon that I didn't know before that I just want to share it with you. So this is from the Pillar New Testament Commentary. It says, "The drafting of Simon was an example of the hated compulsory service that Rome imposed on subjugated Palestine." Let's see, I'll pull it up here so it looks like I'm looking at the screen. A condemned man normally carried his own patibulum, a heavy crossbeam. So this would have been what went across. You'd carry your own crossbar to the site of crucifixion. And Plutarch is quoted as saying, "Every criminal condemned to death bears his cross on his back." At the place of execution, the patibulum was lashed or nailed to the stipes, the upright post. Perhaps because of weakness and blood loss during the flagellation, the beating, Jesus was unable to carry the patibulum, hence the drafting of Simon. Cyrene, the last name, again, similar to last week when we talk about Barabbas as being potential last name, Bar Jonah. These are kind of not just a last name, but it's also a descriptor of either who you're from or where you're from. So Cyrene, on the north coast of Africa, may indicate that Simon was a man of color. Simon's name is preserved in the parallel traditions of Matthew 27 and Luke 23, but Mark includes two other names in connection with Simon, so the other gospel authors don't include his kids. The mention of three personal names in one verse is extremely unusual for Mark. The names are presented as though Simon is unknown to Mark's readers, but that Alexander and Rufus are known to them. Remember, I told you the context of the writing would come back. Of Alexander, we know nothing further, but a Rufus was a member of the church in Rome in the mid-50s, and we see this actually in Romans 16:13. And so Rufus is probably the same Rufus as mentioned here. It is very conceivable that Mark had the phrase father of Alexander and Rufus into the tradition he received because of the happy coincidence that the two sons were members of the church in Rome. This is yet a further indication that Mark writes to Romans. We're not told whether Simon is a Jew or a Gentile, only that he carried a cross. And so, from a discipleship angle, you could also say that Simon was the first literal disciple of Jesus in the sense that he picked up his cross and carried it. He did exactly what Jesus was commanded to do. I thought that was an interesting thought as well. Okay. Crucifixion. Oh, I'm going to do this again. Have a little bit of a description of crucifixion, and I feel like probably we're going to hear a lot of this on Sunday from a preacher, but not a bad thing to go ahead and refamiliarize yourself with. And this is actually coming from Ben Witherington from the Socio-Rhetorical Commentary on Mark. Again, hopefully you have already had your lunch. You may lose your appetite, but death on a cross was a horrendous way to die, for it was basically by means of suffocation that one expired, or possibly a combination of exhaustion and suffocation and exposure to the elements. Eventually, the man could no longer hold his chest cavity, the result of suffocation, often after great gasps for breath. This practice was even considered barbaric by various of the great Roman writers. And of course, Roman citizens were exempt from such a form of execution, which shows that the sentiment of horror was likely rather widespread. Cicero expresses the sentiment well. After calling crucifixion the grossest and most cruel and hideous sort of execution he adds, if we are to be threatened with death, we want to die in freedom. Let the executioner, the shrouding of the head, and the very name of the cross be banished from the body and the life of Roman citizens, from their thoughts, eyes, and ears. So obviously, the concept of crucifixion was even gross and reprehensible to the Roman citizens. Even the Roman one that carried it out, they wouldn't even do it on their own people. All right. What else do we have? Oh, dividing the garment and the casting of lots. Now, we need to see here is that there's lots in this chapter again, lots in this passage that's fulfilled prophecy. Now, I'm not going to show you the fulfilled prophecies, but I'm going to list them for you. So if you want to look them up, just pause and rewind. But the first one is going to be Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6. I didn't do that right, did I? Maybe that was supposed to be 53:6. I wrote down Isaiah 50, verse 6, Psalm 22, especially verses 7 and 18, Psalm 69, especially verse 21, and then Isaiah 53. So maybe I'm right. Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6. I may have written that down incorrectly. If so, apologies. And a reference to the third hour, if you are living in Jerusalem in the first century, you understand the third hour is not 3 a.m. like it is here, but the Jewish people would have started counting the hours of the day from sunrise. So essentially this would be, if the sunrise is at 6 a.m., this would be 9 a.m. So they're guessing that the crucifixion happened at 9 in the morning. The world within the text, I didn't really have a whole lot of the world within the text. There was so much here from historical background that I didn't include it. And I would say the world before the text is just a profound supersaturation of the story. We are so familiar as Christians with the the pinnacle moment of Jesus' life, his crucifixion, that sometimes this can become a little bit rote or routine. And so I would just encourage you to pray for yourself that the Lord would allow you to read, allow you to hear, allow you to experience the crucifixion again in a spirit of renewal, in a fresh way. Let's see. Yeah, these guys were both in our meal prep today. Pillar always feels like it's the predominant commentary, but then Ben Witherington's Gospel of Mark, the socio-rhetorical commentary, is fantastic as well. It's a little shorter, but it's got some very unique insights. So let's get to the big idea. We'll look at the subject, the complement, and the big idea, and this is not going to come as too much of a surprise. It's actually the same thing as stated before. The subject is that question hanging over the entire passage. Why did the people mock Jesus? And even though we looked up all the phrases, we looked up all that context, it didn't really change from this time. The people appear to be a veiled fraud to soldiers, to the chief priests, the scribes, the spectators, the robbers. Everybody looked at him and didn't see who he really was. The disguise was holding. And so they figured if he can't save himself, then he's not the real deal. He's not the Messiah. But they didn't understand, because so much in our default way of doing life is self-preservation and protection. I was thinking about this the other day. It's true that when God created man, he placed eternity, the desire for eternity, in man. But when the fall happened, the fall placed the desire for self-preservation and self-promotion. And so the definition of success, according to the people, for Jesus would have been victory, overruling Rome, not dying, not being arrested, putting down the authorities in charge. And this does not look like victory. So because the circumstances didn't match up with their preconceived notion of Messiah, they believe him to be a fraud. So, the big idea: the soldiers, chief priests, scribes, spectators, and co-crucified robbers. You could sum it up by saying all of humanity mocked Jesus because he appeared to be a failed fraud. We all regarded him according to the flesh, but we don't do that anymore because of what happens soon, because of the resurrection. So I hope that you have enjoyed your time together today. I hope this has helped you to go ahead and prepare your heart and mind for the sermon to come. I encourage you to go ahead and continue digging in deep and prepare your heart and mind for Sunday and the sermon that we are all going to be blessed by. Have a great week. We'll talk to you soon. Bye, church.